the evolving situation in the Middle East on the eve of the one-year anniversary of Hamas's attack on Israel. War is now being waged on two fronts, in Gaza and in Lebanon. Beirut was targeted again this weekend with blasts shaking the city's southern suburbs. Israel considers the area a Hezbollah stronghold. Meanwhile, in Gaza, the Israeli military has issued an evacuation order for the northern part of the enclave. It says it's preparing for a new phase of the now year-long war against Hamas. All of this comes as the world awaits the Israeli response to Iran's direct attack earlier this week when it launched 181 ballistic missiles at Israel. With me now is U.S. Ambassador to Canada, David Cohen. Hi, Ambassador. Pleasure to see you as always. Thank you for making the time.
Well, good morning. It's good to be here.
I appreciate it. I wanted to start off on a question about how worried you are, or your analysis of the risk of a conventional war between Iran and Israel.
So, look, I think that for years, Secretary Blinken, President Biden have been warning about the tremendous risks in the Mideast. It's a tinderbox. And so I think anyone who would say that there's no risk of a conventional war probably kidding themselves. So I'm worried. By the same token, I am cautiously optimistic that that's not the result. I think the United States messaging has been spot on. We have no interest in a war with Iran. And I don't think Iran has any interest in a war with the United States or a war, quite frankly, a conventional war. It's why the reaction of choice, both in April and now in October, were ballistic missiles and not troops. So I think there are some forces that on both sides will help to prevent an escalation to a conventional ground war. I return to where the President has been, where Secretary Blinken has been, which is there must be a diplomatic solution. There has to be a diplomatic solution in Gaza, which will help to diffuse some tensions in Lebanon as well. And there has to be a diplomatic solution in the north that involves Lebanon, the United States, and Hezbollah. And it's only through a diplomatic solution that we can turn the temperature down and sort of remove the risk, at least for the time being.
And I do understand that position, but I guess that position, one that Canada holds as well, kind of comes up against the reality of the situation, which is no party involved in this seems to want to agree to any kind of diplomatic solution at this point. And I'd point to, obviously Hezbollah does not appear to. Hamas does not in any way appear to. But even Israel, a few weeks ago, there was a briefing that occurred from U.S. officials to reporters saying there was a ceasefire agreed to, 21-day pause in the fighting in Lebanon, and the next day Prime Minister Netanyahu came out and said, I have not agreed to that. I understand your position, but what do you think the possibility of an actual diplomatic solution realistically is?
So I think it's impossible to disagree that Israel is not in agreement with a ceasefire and the terms that were proposed when the president made that announcement. That does not mean that Israel is not interested in a ceasefire. I think Israel is interested in a ceasefire.
You do.
It just has to be on the right terms. And I return to some important realities here, which is, first of all, that we always have to remember that it was Hamas and Hezbollah who started this. Israel did not start this. Israel did not go looking for a war with Hamas or a war with Hezbollah. So that's one truth and reality that we always have to keep our eyes on. And the second truth and reality is that Israel must have and does have the absolute right to defend itself. The United States has vociferously advocated for that right and has also stated repeatedly that the United States' commitment to Israel's defense is ironclad. By the same token, we have cautioned Israel, we talk with Israel about using appropriate restraint in its exercise of its rights to defend itself. And I think those conversations have an impact. I think they have had an impact and are having an impact.
Do you, I guess, are you sure of that? And I completely understand the point that you're making. I think, two things can be true at once, and they are of the U.S. and Canada's position, right? Israel absolutely has the right to defend itself. They didn't start this. At the same time, everyone is worried about the scale of that response and the consequences it has had on civilians in particular. I again go back to the fact that the U.S. was under the assumption that there had been an agreed to ceasefire, right? A pause, and not a long-term one, but a pause in the fighting, and then it was something completely different the next day. Can you understand how people would have the impression that the impact that you're describing the U.S. has on that response has actually not come to fruition in the way it would have perhaps even a year ago?
Well, first of all, I think there's no doubt that I think everyone has concerns with the scope of Israel's response in Gaza. Less so in Lebanon and with Hezbollah. I think Israel's response certainly appears to be somewhat restrained.
My final question is about just that. The president has been asked on a number of occasions, and we've asked the same of our defense minister, when you talk about Iran's ballistic missile attack last week on Israel, what a response from Israel would be. Appropriate is the wrong word, but what would a Canadian government endorse or be able to support? What would the U.S. government be able to endorse or support? President Biden has said no to attacking nuclear facilities or counterattacking, aiming at nuclear facilities. He's left the door open to a discussion, is the word he used, on oil facilities. Can you clarify what the U.S. position is on what that response
I think the president's comments were pretty clear as to where the U.S. position is. I think there is always dialogue between Israel and the United States, and that's something that we appreciate. But I think we have to let those conversations remain in the privacy of those conversations. I don't think that we should expect Israel to publicly negotiate or to publicly disclose what its plans to respond to the absolutely unjustified and inappropriate missile attack that Iran launched against Israel, an attack that has been condemned by the United States, by Canada, and by many countries in the world, including many countries in the region. And there's pretty clearly an appropriate response, and probably a better question directed to Israel as to what that appropriate response would be than to the United States ambassador to Canada.
I mean, I have directed it to their ambassador as well.
I'm sure you have.
I ask you only because Canada has been equivocal about what it would and wouldn't support. The defense minister said no to the idea of oil facilities or nuclear facilities. And I'm just asking from the U.S. perspective, is the position that oil facilities is still an open discussion?
I think the president has said that attacks on oil facilities is something that is open for discussion. And I think we have to leave it at that for the time being.
And I will leave it at that for the time being. Ambassador, always a pleasure. I appreciate your time very much.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. That's U.S. Ambassador to Canada, David Cohen. When we come back, we're going to turn to politics here at home as the debate over whether to expand old age security for some seniors takes center stage on Parliament Hill. Can the feds afford to make that move? Government House Leader Karina Gould is my next guest.